Hello, thanks for joining me today. We're going to be going through the entire quick menu for the Sony A6100. Let's get into it. So thank you for joining me. Today we're going to be doing an in-depth dive on the Sony A6100. We're going to go into the quick menu, each one of the menu items, and all of the options inside of each one of these menu items. And we're going to explore a little bit about what they do and when we might use each one of these settings. Now, this is the first video in a series. I'm going to be next tackling the full shooting menu for the 6100. I hope that you join me for that. Before we jump into it, everything that we do here is brought to you by Camera Lessons Online, and we're trying to do something that's very simple, and that is make the knowledge and the skill set necessary to create fantastic visual art with cameras readily accessible to people and not intimidating. And so that's why we have the YouTube channel here to teach photography skills. We have a 4-hour introduction to photography course on the website where we're teaching how to put any of these settings to use to create the kind of art that you want. And we've got a couple books. I hope you go check it out. Without further ado, here's the quick menu for the Sony A6100. When we press our FN button, which stands for function, we bring up something that's called the quick menu, and this is it. It is 12 items in 2 rows, and we're looking at the order and layout that Sony provides out of the box for these. You can go in and change what is inside of the function menu and the order of what's inside of the function menu, and that's going to be something we cover in a different video. Today I want to examine these 12 items. And why these 12 items? Well, these are the ones that Sony believes you will use the most. They're the ones that they put into the quick menu for you, and so they think that they are the most useful, the ones that are most commonly changed in everyday shooting. Now, your shooting circumstances might completely disagree with that, and that's totally fine. I certainly have changed most of the quick menu and button items on my cameras, and that's the way that I prefer to shoot. But we're going to take a look at these, and if you're new to working with cameras, if this is your first SLR or your first mirrorless or your first Sony, then it's not a bad idea to take a look at what they think is particularly useful and knowing how to operate these particular functions. And I promise you, if you can operate these functions plus aperture and shutter, you pretty much have everything that you need to be successful with the camera. Everything else is going to be just extra, which is nice, and it's cool to have extra, but you really need to know just these about 12, 14 things, and you'll be in really good shape. So we're going to start at the top left, and we're going to just move our way slowly to the bottom right. And right now, I wouldn't say that these are in any particular order. At the top left, we have things having to do with the camera's operation in action sequences. So we have the drive mode, which is how many pictures you're getting. The autofocus mode is going to be second that we talk about. That's how the camera is focusing. And then lastly, in those top 3 is going to be the autofocus area, and that's where the camera is focusing. The next 3 on the top row are going to have to do with exposure. And so how bright or dark the image is, changing the ISO, and where the camera is evaluating light, which is called metering. We move to the bottom row, and it's a little bit more of a catch-all kind of feel here. The first 2 things are the flash mode, and the flash exposure compensation. Then we have the color temperature, which is called the white balance, or what color we are adapting for. Then we have the way that the camera processes this information, and that's going to be a picture mode. Then we have silent shooting, and lastly, the shooting mode in video. So let's get into this. We're going to start with the drive mode, and we're selecting it here, and it's in something that we're going to get to that says BKT or bracketing. But we're going to start at the top, and we have single shooting, so you push down the shutter release button, you get 1 picture. We move down here, and notice, by the way, that now we're navigating up and down with this side panel, where we were navigating left, right, up and down through the basics of the quick menu. So now we have the continuous shooting. We have high plus, we have a high, we have a medium, and we have a low. And so low is 3 frames a second, medium is going to be 7 frames a second, high is 8 frames a second. And that high at 8 frames a second is the most that you can get while viewing the image live in between shooting the pictures with minimal blackout time. High plus is 11 frames a second, but you only view the pictures as you shoot them, not the time in between. There wasn't really enough time to make that happen. And so High Plus, you kind of have to guess where your subject is moving to because you're actually looking at the very recent past, a couple milliseconds in the past. So for very fast subjects, High Plus may not be appropriate. Focusing is active throughout all of these. Next, then we have the timer. We have 2-second, 5-second, and 10-second timer. So you shoot the picture, press your shutter release button, and it'll shoot in that given period of time. Next, we're going to have our timer with a continuous shoot at the end. So if you look at this particular option that I've set up, it is 10-second timer, 3 images. And if you notice on that left bar, we have those arrows left and right. That's saying that I can select options inside of this menu option, so kind of a subcategory thing. And if I go through those, I'm going to be able to change how many pictures I get. So for instance, now we're at 5 seconds and 3 images. So 5-second, wait, and then shoots 3 pictures. And we're going to have those kinds of sub-categorization options in many places in our menu and quick menu. So you'll be able to see what we can do there. The next 2 options are going to have to, the next 4 actually, are going to be bracketing options. Now bracketing, which we're going to get to here, I just wanted you to see all of these. Bracketing is where the camera shoots multiple pictures, but it changes something with each one. So continuous bracketing is you hold down the button, you get a series of pictures at different EVs or exposure values. So this is 5 images at a third of a stop difference each. Now, as I say stops or aperture or shutter or ISO, and you're uncomfortable with any of those terms, please do check out, I've got a 5-part introduction to photography exposure essentials on my channel. Highly encourage you to check that out. That'll fill in the exposure information that I am going to gloss over in this video. So here I'm going to shoot a series of pictures at different brightnesses just by holding down the button. So here's 2/3 of a stop or 0.7 difference between 3 images. As you have more images being shot, the amount of difference between them has to change. And that's just because of the math of how much exposure difference the camera is really able to do. So single bracketing relies on you to shoot these pictures individually with the shutter release button, but you have the same number of options on the brightness difference and how many pictures you're doing. I use continuous bracketing a lot more often. Realtors sometimes will use single bracketing in case they want to just double check that nothing's going to change. White balance bracketing is going to be changing the color temperature in a sequence, either a dramatic amount, high, or very low amount of difference, low, so that you can pick the image that has the best color. And that's going along the Kelvin line for the color temperature change that it's making. And the last bracketing option is going to be what they call DRO, which stands for Dynamic Range Optimizer, and that is an auto enhancement. So the auto enhancement, which I actually use for a lot of my shooting, can be bracketed as well, and that can be high or low amount of bracketing. And so it's just 3 pictures shot at different amounts of auto enhancement. So I've never bracketed white balance, and I've never bracketed dynamic range optimizer. I use DRO for shots most of the time, but you're going to find yourself doing single shooting or the low, medium, high burst rate the vast majority of the time that you are taking pictures. So now we're going to get into the focus mode. And the focus mode is going to be how the camera actually pulls focus when you push down your focusing button. You have 5 options inside of here, and we're going to go through them. We start with AFS. Now, AFS is autofocus single shot, and that's where you push the button halfway down just to pull focus, or you set up another button to focus, and that's going to just lock focus on your subject and not change. And that's something we use for really a lot of just non-moving subjects. Now, the camera comes out of the box in AFA, and I'm just going to tell you to not use it. AFA has permission to decide for you if your subject is moving or not. It slows down or makes the lens less accurate because it can't predict what you're going to do. It has permission to change focus on you if it thinks your subject moves, so it's possible for a subject to be in focus and then all of a sudden not be in focus as you shoot a picture. So realistically, don't use AFA. AFC, continuous focus, is for any moving subject, and AFC works brilliantly in Sony cameras. All tracking is going to operate in here, as we're going to see in a little bit. And so this constantly focuses so long as you're pushing down your focusing button. Now the next one is dynamic manual focus. And DMF is to be able to pull focus in an AFS-like mode, and then while holding down that focusing button halfway, move your focus ring and it will allow you to do a manual focus override for fine-tuning. And of course, manual focus is just straight up manual focus. You pull focus in whatever way you want. When I do my video on the menu system of the A6100, we'll take a look at focus peaking and manual focus assist options, which allow you in manual focus to be more accurate. But this is how you get to the manual focus option. So you're going to find yourself in AFS or AFC the vast majority of the time. So next, we're going to take a look at the focusing area. So focus area is where the camera is looking to find the subject that you want to focus on. You're going to have a lot of options here. Wide is going to have permission to use the entirety of the frame to figure out where your subject is. Now, focusing systems operate under two basic premises. The first is that your subject is likely to be in the middle of the frame, and the second is that your subject is likely to be closer to you. If it has to guess between those two, it does its best job. But when you have something in the middle of the frame, but it pulls focus on the side, it's because it guessed incorrectly given those algorithms. So wide, it has permission to use any part of the frame. You are relying on it to figure out the appropriate subject, but it allows it to find a subject anywhere within the frame. Zone truncates that to a smaller subsection of the frame, and you can navigate that subsection anywhere you want inside of the frame. Center dumbs down the camera. It is just the very center of the frame, and it can't be moved, adjusted, differently shaped. It is just going to focus in a box in the very middle of the frame. So you can dumb down the camera in a case of an emergency, and you can just put that over your subject, pull focus, and then figure out what went wrong later on. So next is a very, very useful area, and that's the flexible spot. Now, this is a spot you can navigate through the frame, and you can change its size. You'll see three letters, L, M, and S, which is large, medium, small. So here we've got a medium-sized crosshair, and then I navigated that through the frame. But to show you the difference here, let's go to a large one, and you can see it's quite a bit bigger. Now, when do you use one rather than another? The larger it is, the more likely it is to find something to focus on. I've got a black case in front of us here, and if I just put a small crosshair over just the middle part of that black, it may not find anything to focus on. A larger crosshair, I don't control it as much, but it finds something to focus on more easily. Typically speaking, we use the largest crosshair that will actually find our subject, and we have the best success that way. So now what I'm looking at here is what's called an expanded flexible spot. And an expanded flexible spot, as you could see, was a small box with a larger one around it. And that's done because if it can't, it tries to use the middle box to find a subject, but if it can't find enough information to focus, it uses the outside area. So now I went down to the last option, which is the tracking, and it's telling me I can't do it. I wanted you to see this intentionally. So if there's a setting that is in place that makes it so that another setting can't be used, it will let you know. So it's saying that you cannot use tracking because you're in single shot AF. So let's go back to our function menu and fix that. We're going to go back to function, go over here and change AFS to AFC, move back over, and now I can choose tracking, the very bottom option. This only works in continuous focus. Now, tracking gives you all of your other focus area options that you've already had, left and right, selectable, and you can use those to find the subject that it will then follow through the frame. So you have wide, you have zone, you have center, you have the flexible spot, large, medium, small. So let's take a look at this here. What do I want to choose? So here is just a wide area, and it just is figuring out what to focus on, and then it's tracking it as the camera moves. Very cool. But if I change that to a flexible spot, I can navigate that on what I want it to track. I can then begin focusing, and while I'm focusing, you'll see it follow that object in the frame and track it effectively. This works for any kind of moving subject. It works brilliantly. So that's the basics of tracking. In another video, I'm going to set up an A6100 for action sequences, and you're going to see how we actually tailor tracking to be either stickier or more responsive. That is going to be in a menu dive kind of video. So now let's move on to exposure compensation. In aperture priority, shutter priority, or program mode, we go into exposure compensation, spin our wheel, and we can change the brightness of the photograph that we record. Negative numbers are darker, positive numbers are brighter. And so it's a fast and easy way of changing brightness in a non-manual mode. It didn't change for me because we're doing this in manual. So next is going to be ISO. Now, of course, inside of here, we can select whatever ISO we would want, but we also have our auto options. Now it's telling me you can't actually use the noise reduction auto ISO because silent shooting is turned on. So we're going to fix that real fast. So notice it told me why I couldn't do what I wanted to do. I change silent shooting, turn it off, come back here, and now I can select. This first auto ISO says multi-frame NR, which stands for noise reduction. This is where it shoots multiple pictures and uses them to create one image that it is going to be my final product with the least amount of noise. Because if I shoot multiple images, noise is randomly generated. I can overlay them to figure out what's noise and what's the actual image. You can't do it in silent. There's a couple other restrictions in noise reduction mode. If we're in noise reduction, also your ability to trigger the camera through Wi-Fi doesn't operate. So here I've got a couple options. I can actually set the ISO, or I can leave it to auto, and I can turn the amount of noise reduction to high or leave it in standard. So I have two options inside of my multi-frame noise reduction to be able to adjust it. So now we're going to come back over here, and here's standard auto ISO, and it gives me the options of ISO minimum and ISO maximum value. Now, one thing is important, and that is if you go into the full menu, you can say, if I'm in auto ISO, what do I want my minimum shutter speed to be? That's not an option inside of this portion of the frame. So now I've gone to 100 ISO, and that has completely underexposed my shot because I'm in manual. And now as I bring up my ISO, I'm going to be able to see that picture become properly exposed. And the reason for that is in manual, you're setting up that exposure yourself. So next is going to be our metering mode. Now, metering is where the camera looks as it builds an exposure. Where within the frame is it examining in order to decide how bright the shot should be? You have three options inside of here. The first one is going to be called multi-segmented. They just say multi at the top here, but Sony's full term is multi-segmented. This is going to put some emphasis on the point of focus, but evaluate the entirety of the frame. The next one down is going to be center-weighted, and center-weighted is going to weight the middle 25% of the frame much more heavily than the surrounding 75%. And spot is using a very small spot based off of the focusing point in the frame to be able to evaluate the shot. As you're choosing that, know that as you use a smaller size to evaluate light, you're going to get more fluctuation between pictures. So the camera comes out of the box in multi-segmented, and the reason for that is as you shoot 10, 11 pictures in a row, they're not going to be very different from each other, even if you have a very contrasty scene. As you have center-weighted or spot metering and you move the camera slightly, you will see differences in exposure between each one of those images because you've told it to constantly reevaluate a smaller percentage of the frame. I typically leave this in center-weighted and almost never change it, but that's because I shoot in manual exposure mode. So now we've moved over to flash, and you have 5 options: off, auto, on, slow, and rear. So let's take a look. The on or the fill flash always fires the flash, provided it's popped up. You have to do that yourself. Now, auto, I can't select. And the reason I can't select auto is because the camera is in manual mode. So let's take a look at a couple of these other ones before we deal with those first two. Slow slows down the shutter speed. Now, the reason that you would do this is anything the flash doesn't light is darker, right? So if we slow down the shutter speed, that's what the slow and slow sync is, it's going to build in more exposure in the background not lit by your flash. Rear fires the flash at the end of the exposure rather than the beginning. And we do that if we have moving lights within the frame, and if a subject's going to be closer to us at the end of a frame than the beginning, then we want that subject to be bigger and better exposed. So we might do rear exposure or rear sync. So off is kind of useless in my opinion inside of this menu, and the reason for that is if you don't want a flash to fire, you just push it down. It will not come up on its own, even in full auto mode. And the auto is not very useful because we have to pop the flash up and be in auto mode, and then we're relying on it to get it right, whether or not a flash should be fired. It's better to leave it in fill flash mode and then just pop up a flash if you want it, push it down if you don't. Now, if you are using a flash, our next menu option is here, and that's going to be the flash compensation. It looks just like exposure compensation, but it's just how bright the flash is. Positive numbers are brighter, negative numbers, of course, are darker. If you put an auxiliary flash onto the camera, this will affect that as well. I should point out that in previous cameras, there's been another option in the flash menu or quick menu option, and that's been for wireless flash. That's been moved to a menu item, not part of the flash mode in the quick menu. So it still will do wireless flash if you have a wireless a flash that can trigger as a wireless flash, or their commander, the C1 commander on the camera. But the built-in flash cannot trigger through optical slave, and it's been put just as a menu item. All right, let's get into white balance. Now, this is how the camera adjusts to the color of light. AWB is how it comes out of the box, which is auto white balance. Then we have these symbols: daylight, shade, cloudy day, incandescent. And you're going to notice the color change to adapt for the color of light that you're telling the camera you are under. So since shade, for instance, and cloudy day cools down color temperature, it compensates by adding those warm orange and red tones. And then we're going to have incandescent and several different types of fluorescence in here. So warm white, cool white, I think it's 4 different ones. And then a couple other options. We have if a flash is the predominant light source, if it's in an underwater housing, that's what we're in right now. Then we have directly selecting the Kelvin of the color temperature. So that's the actual point in the measurement system between yellow and blue that we are inside of. And by the way, when you look over on the right, we're going to get into this in a second. The Kelvin is labeled as 5,500 degrees K, right? That's what 5,500 K is. We are now in a custom white balance, so that's what the set is. This is going to be another change for us. Previously, in Sony cameras, after the custom white balance saved modes, is 1, 2, and 3, there would be an option that just said set, like you're seeing in the middle of the screen at the bottom. Here, it's been moved into each one of the custom white balances, so that you don't have to pick a register for a saved white balance to go into. You do that at the beginning. I think it's going to be perfectly convenient for people. On the far right, you're seeing A to B and G to M. A to B is yellow to blue, and then G to M is green to magenta shift. Now, we're going to get into that because we can actually change any of these to adjust to yellow, blue, green, and magenta differently than they are presetted to do. But right now you have 3 different custom white balance registers. You use those if you're coming back to a regular situation and you want to make sure the color is correct or at least consistent. And so when I shoot in the studio, I white balance my lights once, and I can come back to that white balance setting anytime I use my strobes. Same would be true if you shoot pictures during swim meets at a particular indoor swimming pool. It might be terrible light, but it might be the same every single time, and you can white balance to that in a custom way and come back to the same settings every time. So if I want to adjust one of these and make it a little bit more tailored to a specific kind of light that I'm in, I can do that. So I have this right arrow, I go in, and then I get this 4-quadrant graph, green to magenta, yellow to blue. And I can navigate, as you're seeing me do here with this orange dot, I can change how adjusted I am for these different colors. You're going to see the color on this on the screen itself of this image live. You'll see that change as we go. All right. So next is what they call creative style, and this is telling the camera how to adjust the image as it shoots it for 3 points: contrast, saturation, and clarity, or what's also known as sharpness. Sharpness, by the way, is not an out of focus picture becoming sharper. Sharpness or clarity is when you enhance the contrast just at the edge of a subject. So we've got several different presets: standard, vivid, portrait, landscape, monochrome, sepia. You're going to notice that the neutral has been taken out of this from previous cameras. Your closest is probably going to be the portrait mode, because that tries to get accurate color tone. Sunset and vivid are going to have the most enhancement of your color temperature. So next is going to be silent shooting, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's firing the pictures just by scanning the sensor rather than moving a mechanical shutter. A couple caveats to that: you can just turn it on and off, and it will either make sound or not make sound. Flash does not fire if silent shooting is turned on. If you are inside with fluorescent lights, you can get things called banding, which is where you're actually seeing the flicker of the light source in your image, and this is almost an impossible thing to edit out of a picture. And so I would beware of silent shooting in those kind of circumstances. Also, if you have subjects moving significantly, you get something called rolling shutter. The camera scans the image from top to bottom in a silent shooting mode, and if the subject's moving, it might be in a different place in the left side of the screen as opposed to the right by the time it stops scanning from top to bottom. So you can actually stretch or squeeze a subject depending on the movement of the subject throughout the frame. So beware of those couple situations, but this will make the camera completely silent when firing. Now our next option is going to seem a little bit weird, and that is shooting mode. And if you try to select it, it just says, hey, just change the mode at the top of the dial, at the top of the camera. And so you might ask, why would you even have this as a menu option? It is not for still shooting. It is for video shooting. So if we change our shooting mode to video, to shooting movies, now all of a sudden we can decide to shoot video in program, video aperture, video shutter priority, or video manual. And we might shoot our video in a totally different mode. The reason that we shoot video as its own shooting mode rather than just being in manual or shutter priority and pressing the video button is it previews the 16:9 aspect ratio on your screen before you hit record. That's what it does. In any mode in the camera, you can start shooting video, and it will show you your audio levels, and it will shoot 16:9, and it'll be the same video quality. But you get this preview in the video mode that's really nice to set up your shot with. And so I'm a big fan of that. This is not a video about how to set up a camera for video. I might do that. But typically we shoot video in either shutter priority or fully manual because we have to be able to select the shutter speed that we want. Another thing for me to point out is when we're shooting video, you're seeing the audio levels as channel 1, channel 2 on the screen, which is really useful. All right. That is the full function menu of the Sony A6100. I hope that this was useful and helpful as you're getting the camera off the ground. How would I set this up to begin with? Well, it depends on how comfortable you are with shooting. But initially, the main things I would play with would be shooting, if you've never shot with an SLR before, trying out the different focusing areas, trying out AFS and AFC, and trying out exposure compensation and playing with that to begin with, and with the different drive modes. That's kind of a good way to introduce yourself to how powerful the camera is and then start exploring from there. Thanks for watching. Very much appreciate it. Of course, if this is useful, we always ask you to like and subscribe, and have a wonderful day. We'll see you next time.